It has been a punishing flu season so far, with thousands of hospitalizations and even the deaths of 2 otherwise healthy children in Guelph. And as peak flu season continues, we could all do with a reminder that despite the advances in modern medicine that make the flu shot widely available, influenza is nothing to trifle with. Joining us now for more, Natasha Crowcroft. She is Chief of Applied Immunization Research and Evaluation with Public Health Ontario. Vanita Dubé, Associate Medical Officer of Health with Toronto Public Health, and Heather McDougall, Professor of History at the University of Waterloo. And we are happy to have 3 such knowledgeable people here today for a very, very timely and important subject. To you first, how bad is the flu this year?
It looks like in Toronto, we're going to be on record for one of our worst flu seasons in the past 10 years. One
of the worst in 10 years. Any idea why?
We seem to have this double epidemic right now, what we're calling it. So influenza A and B, 2 different strains are circulating at the same time. And we know that it's hitting the elderly a lot, and people are getting sick.
Presumably fewer people would get sick if more people got the flu shot, right?
That's right, yeah.
What percentage are in fact getting the flu shot?
We know from Canadian surveys that about 30% of Canadians are getting the flu shot. The number's higher in elderly, about 65%, but we're not reaching our targets.
What's the target?
For those that are considered high risk, so elderly, really young children, if you have a chronic condition, at least 80%, and we're nowhere close to that.
Let's talk about what percentage necessarily has to be vaccinated for this thing to work. Obviously, 100% of the people don't have to be vaccinated to make sure that 100% of the people don't get the flu, right?
This is true, but flu's a bit different from other vaccines. You're referring to this idea of herd immunity, which we use for vaccines like measles. For flu, we really want people to be vaccinated for their own sake and for protecting people immediately around them. But we've never reached the levels of vaccination where we'd expect to see what we call herd immunity. And one of the reasons for that is because the vaccine is not as effective as other vaccines. So it's much, much harder to get to that level.
It's not as effective because essentially you're guessing a year earlier as to what it's going to be the following year. Is that right?
Yeah. This is all about how do you outsmart the flu virus, and it's always ahead of us. It takes us about 6 months to make the vaccine. So from when we decide what's going to go in the vaccine, it takes 6 months. So at that point, we're giving flu a 6 months head start. And by the time the vaccine's rolling out and going into people's arms, the virus has often mutated and changed.
More on this in a few moments. Some people may wonder why we have a historian on this program right now to talk about what's going on with the flu today. But the fact of the matter is, obviously this is nothing new, and we need to have a better understanding of history so we can understand what's going on now. What in your research has been the most virulent flu strain that we've had, say, in our lifetimes?
Oh, in our lifetimes, it would be, I think, H1N1, although the H3N2, which is this year's virus, is giving the previous one a run for its money.
And H1N1 is where, that's not even 10 years ago yet, is it?
No, well, it's 2009.
2009.
And it was, of course, also labeled swine flu in the United States.
How deadly was it?
Worldwide, I don't think it was quite as deadly as anticipated, and certainly nothing compared to the 1918 version of it, which is the Great Spanish Flu Pandemic, which was estimated to kill roughly 20 to 40 million people worldwide, and probably was actually responsible for many, many more deaths than that, because we never had accurate stats from India and China.
Let's talk about that a little more. This is 100 years ago.
Yes.
Spanish flu. We had 8,000 dead in Ontario.
Right.
50,000 in Canada. And remember, this is 50,000 on a population of 8 million, not 36 million.
Exactly.
So this is a big deal. I recall well, I don't recall from firsthand knowledge, I'm not quite that old, but they did cancel the Stanley Cup that year because a player for the Montreal Canadiens died.
Yes.
A guy by the name of Joe Hall. Put that into some context, if you would. What's the most significant outbreak more recently that has had a real impact on our healthcare system and the public?
I would think that in terms of having an impact on the public and the healthcare system, it would be SARS in 2003. Because, of course, that was a coronavirus that was not identified when the outbreak began, at least in Toronto. And it was the BC Michael Smith Center that did actually identify it. So when you're dealing with an outbreak where you don't know what is causing it, you don't know how contagious it is, you don't know the duration of the incubation period, let alone the follow-up infective period, there are real problems. And of course, that was also a period when we had massive political conflict between Ottawa and Queen's Park, with the result that Toronto Public Health basically had to fight in the dark, I think quite successfully, to contain it within the boundaries of the city as much as possible.
And yet, if memory serves, I think 44 people died.
They did die, yes.
In the city.
Yes, a lot of healthcare workers, yes.
You wanted to pick up on that?
Yeah, I wanted just a slightly different angle on it. There's probably about 3,500 people a year die from flu in Canada. And a lot of those deaths are hidden. So, and that's from seasonal influenza. So there's a lot of focus on the pandemic, rightly, because a new virus could come and could be devastating. And we're watching that, with a lot of concern. But it's easy to take for granted what happens every year. The familiar becomes kind of discounted. And people are dying all the time. And very recently, we published some research on heart attacks and how those are linked to influenza infections. So these deaths that are caused by influenza are not necessarily picked up as influenza deaths. And that's going on all the time, and it's hidden in plain sight.
Understood. But picking up on the Spanish flu example, what did we learn from 100 years ago that you think is particularly relevant to how we handle things today?
So I think the fact that we have a whole platform for delivering vaccine, and we do have a vaccine. It's old-fashioned, it's developed in eggs. We need to move beyond that technology, and there's research going on to try and move the technology forward. We have a public health system that's able to respond. The organisation I work for, Public Health Ontario, was established because of the SARS epidemic in order to strengthen public health in Ontario. So we've put in a lot of things in place. Toronto Public Health has fantastic teams that are ready to respond to outbreaks. So the technology needs to improve, the vaccines need to improve, but they're pretty good at the moment. On average, 50% protective. If I gave you a lottery ticket and said, you've got a 50% chance of winning,
take that.
You take that.
Yeah, no kidding.
So although we say they're not good enough and they have to be better, they're not awful. I think the big challenge we face really is in people's hearts and minds. People don't believe in immunisation.
Well,
a lot of people don't.
I suspect that's part of it. I think the other part, Vineeta, is people are just content to take their chances and then don't want to bother making the time to go to the clinic at work or to their GP and get the shot, right? 58%
think that it's not necessary. 17% don't think that it's going to be of benefit. Only 10% don't make the time for it. So it's now that we have it at pharmacies and public health offices, doctor's offices, the time doesn't seem to be the bigger issue. It's really playing on, it's still necessary. Every year it's necessary. And I think if we could at least make the point that if you're at high risk, if you're a young child, 5 and under, if you're 65 and older, if you have a chronic health condition, make sure you get the vaccine. And then healthcare workers, if you can expose vulnerable individuals like these individuals, pregnant women, you should also get the vaccine. Let's focus on them. If we can get our rates up higher there, we'll be doing something. I hate like hell to bring this up, but I think it's true. Every time a child dies, there is a rush to get the vaccine. Isn't that right? That's right. And yet every year children actually die. And CDC did some work that showed that 90% of children that died were not vaccinated. We know that healthy children die. It's not just children who have chronic conditions that die as well. And so actually every year there should be a rush on getting the vaccine, but the rush should be in October and November and not when it's, really late in the season. Why is it always in the winter? Why is flu always in the winter? That's the seasonality for flu. It tends to circulate at that time. People tend to be indoors. It tends to transmit better in the wintertime. Unlike in a pandemic, where you can get a pandemic that will spread across the season, and that's, I guess, the difference between seasonal flu and pandemic flu. Gotcha. Okay, Natasha, tell me about this. You touched on it a little bit earlier, but I want to come back and dive a little deeper right now. The flu shot every year is basically, as you indicated, a guess from almost a year earlier on what the strain is going to morph into the following year. And obviously a lot goes into trying to make sure that you get it as close as possible to whatever the strain ends up being. How good are you at doing that?
Well, it varies from year to year is the honest answer. Sometimes we get it right and hit the jackpot. Most of the vaccines we use have got 3 strains in it, so sometimes we get all 3 right. Now we're increasingly using vaccines with 4 strains. This year we did pretty well with 2 of the strains, and 1 we did badly with, and unfortunately the one that isn't matching as well as the H3N2, which is the more severe one of the reasons we're having problems. So, you know,
is it better than a crapshoot?
It's definitely better than a crapshoot,
okay.
But what's happening now in the research environment is people are looking at other ways of producing vaccines. So one important thing is to move away from using eggs, because we're making vaccines in eggs, which is decades-old technology. It takes a long time, and it takes a lot of eggs, which can be a problem sometimes if there's a problem with egg production. So, so moving towards making vaccines that are in cell culture or even made in plants, which is a very interesting new way, because plants grow so quickly, you can gear up production very quickly. We're also looking at new ways of delivering vaccines, like the live vaccine that's been around for a few years now. Making vaccines stronger for people who are more at risk, like the elderly, by putting in extra things into the vaccine to boost the effect, or more antigen, like making them just stronger. And then in the academic side, something I find fascinating, I don't know, I hope you might as well, where looking at the actual structure of the virus, we make these vaccines based on particular antigens. These are things that promote immunity.
Is that really what they look like on that screen behind us? Is that really the flu?
You'd have to have very good eyes.
Okay.
So there's a globular head to the main antigen. That is what people respond to, and that's the bit that the virus outsmarts us with. The thing we respond to and make antibodies to, the virus changes, and we're always trying to keep up with that. So what researchers are trying to do is figure out to get at other bits of the virus that don't change, and figure out how to make a vaccine to the bits of the virus that don't change every year. So my ideal future would be a vaccine that covers every strain of influenza virus, that's safe and effective. And a real nirvana would be if you could give it to people in a patch, because I think if we didn't inject things into people, then they'd feel better about it.
It's still a needle, right?
People
don't like the needle?
Yeah, and all that technology is coming.
It's coming.
Yeah.
I've heard this expression, drift and shift. What does that mean?
Well, Natasha basically just explained to a large extent what that is, but it's the reason that the current vaccine production issues are issues, in the sense that because the virus is much, much smarter than human beings, it will either drift, meaning it's moving, or it will shift shape. And when it does that, it doesn't matter what the choice the World Health made based on what happened in China and Australia and the Southern Hemisphere during their flu season. The vaccine has outsmarted us yet again, and by the time our vaccine is actually produced and going into people's arms, it appears to be less effective. And I think one of the other issues is that I've noticed in the press that there are constant references to the fact that the vaccine, according to the CDC or the BC Centre for Disease Control and other Canadian researchers, it's only sort of 16% effective for this component of the vaccine, and 36% for, just as an example. That tends, I think, to make the public question why, in spite of what Toronto Public Health and Public Health Ontario are saying and all of the messaging, why should we do this if it's only such a limited effectiveness? And it's really ironic because, of course, 100 years ago, people were desperate. And they tried creating vaccines. Connaught Laboratories existed at that point, and it and the predecessor to Public Health Ontario both produced vaccines, which they tried out in the soldiers. Unfortunately, they didn't work because they didn't know at that point that it was a filterable virus, so they weren't working with the right types of material. And then the other complicating factor was that we were sending an expeditionary force to Siberia, and the troops were picked up in Halifax. They were sick when they left Halifax, and every place that they stopped, they dropped off sick soldiers. So although we were also picking it up from the United States, it spread courtesy in many ways of the Canadian Army and World War I.
Given medical advances in so many things, don't you think this is something that we should have sort of been able to nail by now?
It's not all doom or die. Next year in Ontario, 65 years and older will get a free high-dose flu zone vaccine. And so that's one of the souped up vaccines, and that's going to be free for all the elderly. So that's a step in the right direction. Let's not treat influenza with antibiotics to make it clear to individuals that antibiotics are not going to help you when you're sick. You got to get the vaccine. Let's do more to make sure that we get people washing their hands enough, staying home when they're sick. That's still a big issue. And let's really get the message out for children, especially children 5 and under. They get a lot of vaccines, but there's a nasal spray now that's available if you're 2 years and older. And so that gets around the needle. And so there are other ways that we can actually address this right now that are pretty effective.
Do you know, I mean, we have a very large pharmacological business here in the province of Ontario. Do you know whether or not all the vaccines people get in Ontario are actually made in Ontario?
They're not. No, not all of the vaccines are made in Ontario.
I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just curious.
Yeah.
So they're
vaccine manufacturing is a worldwide industry, and but that being said, there are a lot of checks and balances that Health Canada has to make sure that the vaccines that are provided in Canada and in Ontario are have the checks and balances in place to make sure that they're safe and that they're effective.
Do we not make enough here for the, like, is it a question of production? We couldn't make enough for all the people that need it here?
Natasha, you might know more about production. Yeah,
it's a global. I mean, it's a global industry. So, in the same way that car manufacturing isn't all happening in Canada, it's exactly the same. It's a financial.
We haven't had a problem with shortages this year, per se, of the flu vaccine. So it's not that we're not making enough. That there's more demand than what people want. We have enough vaccine. We have to create demand in individuals to take it.
If someone got the vaccine this year, would it actually potentially still, Heather, cover them for next year?
It would depend very much on what the dominant strain is next year. And
so it's possible then?
Potentially, but it's not, I think, terribly likely that it'll be the same. Is it, Natasha?
There may be some similarities, but the WHO's prediction is that the H3N2 strain will be different. And last week they announced the new strains for the next season, and they've changed the H3N2 strain, which is one of the 3 or 4 strains that's in the vaccine. So WHO's bet is on it not being good enough. The other thing is that your immunity actually wanes during the month. So even within the season, your immunity starts to wear off, so that if there's a late flu season, people who are immunized early can sometimes have lost their immunity towards the end. So I absolutely would not rely on last year's vaccine for next year's flu.
I presume there is a cumulative benefit as well if you get it year after year after year after year after year.
Not actually, no. In fact, there's some of the really interesting research is coming out, which again goes back to the universal flu vaccine idea, which we really need, is that immunity to flu is quite complex. There's this expression called, and forgive me, Heather, original antigenic sin, which is about how the very first either vaccine or virus you're exposed to teaches your immune system something that it never forgets. And the next time you get exposed, you remember your first love and not the one you're being exposed to. So your immune reaction is, so your vaccine this year may make you sort of boost your immunity to the first vaccine you got a few years ago instead of the one you're getting now. All I'm saying is it's complicated, and that's why the research on the universal vaccine idea, which is going on in different models in different places, is very tricky. It needs to benefit from all the advances in immunology that have gone on, and it's very complex. So it's going to be slow. It's not going to happen quickly.
Okay, Vanita, let's try this. Just as economists have predicted 10 of the last 5 recessions, if you know what I mean, we have been hearing that the big one is coming. Is it?
The pandemic.
Yeah.
Well, we just had a pandemic in 2009, and typically they cycle over decades. So I'm not making any predictions on when our next pandemic is.
You saying the H1N1 was a pandemic in 2009?
That's what we called it. Yeah.
You called it that, but I mean, it wasn't.
It wasn't as severe.
Yeah.
In terms of impact on health, it wasn't a severe pandemic, but it certainly caused illness throughout the year. It infected individuals across the world. And so it meets the definition of pandemic. It was just a less severe one. So certainly we should be mindful that the next pandemic that comes, we're probably not going to get off so easy, and it's probably going to be worse. But I'm not hedging my bets on when that'll be.
But that's I mean, Heather, that's the thing people keep telling us to watch out for, that we are due for something that's going to kill, tens of thousands of people.
Exactly.
Right? Do you want to hazard a guess as to when we're going to see that?
Oh, historians never predict the future.
There you go, sorry. But based on your knowledge of the past,
yes,
you'd have to say we're kind of due, wouldn't you?
Well, it's interesting because you see, if you look at 1918, the next major flu pandemic was 1957. And then there's a brief, very brief break to 1968-69. But from 1969 to 2009, there wasn't anything, and yet there was a tremendous amount of doom and gloom, and certainly all through the 1990s, this fear of pandemics. So, and then we get to 2009. It's very difficult to predict anything like that. The major thing is that we do have, 100 years later, much, much more knowledge, effective public health services. The only thing I think that we may not have, unfortunately, is this sense of community and camaraderie. The major thing that saved lives in 1918, because of course, flu tended to lead to secondary infections, and most people died of bronchial pneumonia or their lungs basically filling up with fluid. It was a ghastly, ghastly death. Some survived because of good nursing. And yet when whole families were ill, the community had to rally round. And that happened across Canada and the United States and any other country affected by the flu. Would we get the same kind of response? When we do the pandemic planning, I remember in 2009 thinking, oh my God, I guess I'm going to have to learn how to make massive amounts of soup, because if we quarantine the students in the residences at the University of Waterloo, somebody has to feed them. If the food production staff are sick, well then, the community's got to pitch in. And my question would be, do we still have the sense of community that would encourage people not just to line up, but to do the kind of social service that happened in 1918?
Well, the only, where do we go here? The year that SARS broke, that was 2003, I think.
Yeah.
We had a big blackout in Ontario as well that year, and people did pitch in.
They did.
You know, there were elderly people who were stuck in apartment buildings, you know, elevators not working, couldn't get out.
Yeah.
The neighbors did pitch in, so that presumably should give us some encouragement.
But Steve, we're practically a whole generation since the 2003.
I guess.
And my sense is that it's a much more me-focused generation. The other big question, what would they do if the internet failed?
Well, there is that. Yes.
Well, the other point here, though, is that healthy people who get the flu shot every year are getting it to protect themselves, but also to protect others. We know that those rates are low, and so you could kind of take that analogy that if you want to help others, protect others, have that sense of community, get the shot yourself every year.
What did we learn in, let's go back to 2003 with SARS, what did we learn trying to negotiate our way through that crisis that you think is useful to knowing today?
I think the public health system is much stronger. I wanted to go back to this issue of community solidarity. I'm a great believer in the goodness of people, and I think people do step up in emergencies. In terms of preparing, one of the things we have learned is the need to have a good seasonal vaccination program and to get people, I agree with everything that Vanita and Heather have said, we need people to be stepping up and getting themselves immunised. And doing all the other things you do to prevent flu. And if we don't have that bedrock of a good seasonal program, we won't have it there to build on in the case of a pandemic. It's not just about having the vaccine and the clinics and the people involved. It's also having that community solidarity and people thinking this is the right thing to do. And there's been some really interesting research about attitudes on moral purity and liberty, where, and this is about vaccine hesitancy in general, where parents feel that vaccines are sort of contaminating their children and that they should be free to do what they like. And fairness not being important to some people. I'm not talking about communities in general, but to people who really don't trust vaccines. And so I think from the public health perspective, we could do a better job in trying to explain that we're trying to prevent children from being contaminated by virus, that the vaccine is a way of protecting and keeping people's liberty to stay healthy. It's like trying to understand the perspectives of people who are really not on board. We're not getting high enough uptake.
Let me follow
how do
up.
we address that?
Let me follow up with Vanita on that. Do we have much of an anti-vaxxer movement in this country?
We know for childhood immunizations, about 1 to 3% of children don't get vaccinated, and that's because parents are quote-unquote anti-vaccine.
1 to 3%, that's
so
not that much.
that's not our big issue, but we know that there's a growing group of parents, about 19%, that are what we call vaccine hesitant. They have questions about vaccine, and so there's questions about vaccine confidence. They may not think vaccines are as important, and so that's probably the bigger group that are concerning, because the vaccine hesitant parents, most of them now are getting vaccinated, but if they switch into the, I don't want to get the vaccine at all for my child, then that's concerning.
But I'm just wondering what more you folks can do, given that you can get the vaccine at your GP, you can get it at work, if you know, some workplaces. They probably give it to kids at school.
So it's available, right?
Yeah, it's available,
but it's more than just availability. We have to talk about what are the questions that people have, what are the myths that they're getting, and where the misinformation that they're getting, which if you do a Google search, you're going to get some good information and some bad information. And if you can't sift through that information, you're going to think that all vaccines are really bad. And so we have to be able to counter the prevailing bad information with the right information and make parents realize what the truth is on vaccines.
I wouldn't necessarily have put this at the top of the list, but how about teaching the 1918 Spanish flu? Maybe a little history lesson would be good to get people uptaking more.
The irony in that, Steve, is that there we have 50,000 dead Canadians on top of 60,000 killed in the war. The memory of the 1918 flu faded almost entirely until the 1960s. And yes, what I have noticed over my teaching career is that as we're moving more and more away from political and economic history, we are putting the social history in. And students are horrified when you tell them about 1918. But it certainly has resonance for some people. Other people basically say, no, that was the past. We are in the 21st century, a much superior world. It's not relevant. And yet, I think history is the foundation, obviously, for understanding our world.
It's interesting. In a way, it's a tribute to what you two do, that people are so confident that you're going to figure this out that they don't feel a need to get vaccinated. But I would like you to give those numbers one more time. More people died of the flu than died in World War I. More Canadians.
Well, 50,000 civilians die of the flu, and then 60,000 of our soldiers die.
So about the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Amazing.
And that's just the stats we know about.
Right, right. Because there would be probably more who died of the flu that we don't know about.
Well, there are two follow-up epidemics in 1919 and again in 1920,
right.
And as it moved into the Indigenous communities, their death rates were far higher than the settler society.
Gotcha. That's our time, folks. Thanks so much for helping us understand this a lot more. Vanita Dubé, who is with Toronto Public Health, Natasha Crowcroft with Public Health Ontario, Heather McDougall from the University of Waterloo. Good to have all three of you on TVO tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.